The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway hummed their endless, monotonous song, a sound that had become synonymous with broken dreams and shattered promises. 8-year-old Sarah Mitchell sat rigidly on the hard wooden bench, her small frame barely making an impression on the unforgiving surface. Her patent leather shoes, polished to an uncomfortable shine, dangled several inches above the cold gray floor. She didn't swing her legs or fidget with youthful restlessness. Instead, she remained perfectly still, as if any movement might shatter the fragile equilibrium she'd worked so hard to maintain over the past 3 months. In her small hands, Sarah clutched Mr. Floppy, a stuffed rabbit whose once white fur had faded to a dingy cream color from years of love and worry. His button eyes stared up at her with an expression of eternal patience, as if he understood exactly what she was going through. She'd had Mr. Floppy since she was 3 years old, and he was the one constant in her increasingly chaotic world. When everything else felt uncertain and frightening, his familiar softness grounded her. This morning, she'd grabbed him from her bed at her mother's house without thinking, a decision her father had later commented on with what sounded like annoyance. She squeezed him a little tighter at the memory. Beside her sat her mother, Jennifer Mitchell, a woman who looked far older than her 42 years. Jennifer's blonde hair, usually kept in a neat bob, was slightly disheveled today, strands falling from the clip she'd used to style it. Her hazel eyes, which Sarah remembered being warm and laughing, now carried the weight of desperation and barely concealed anxiety. Jennifer wore a navy blue dress that she'd bought specifically for today, something professional and respectable, as if her appearance in court might somehow outweigh the allegations her husband's attorney had filed against her. Every few seconds, Jennifer's right hand would flutter to her purse, fidgeting with the clasp, her nails bitten down to the quick, betraying her nervous state. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible, more a prayer than a reassurance. She reached over to squeeze Sarah's hand, but the touch felt tentative, uncertain. Sarah noticed the tremor in her mother's fingers and realized, with the kind of clarity that children sometimes possess when their worlds are falling apart, that her mother was terrified. This terrified her further. On the other side of the courtroom doors, in the main gallery, sat Sarah's father, David Mitchell. He was a handsome man in his mid-40s, with dark hair graying at the temples in a way he considered distinguished. His tailored suit cost more than Jennifer's monthly rent, a fact he'd mentioned several times during their last custody exchange. He sat with the kind of confident posture that suggested he had no doubt about the outcome of today's proceedings. Beside him sat his attorney, Mr. James Preston, a shark in an expensive suit who'd successfully won 3 contentious custody cases in the past year alone. Mr. Preston was whispering something to David, and David's face bore a thin smile that Sarah had come to recognize as dangerous. It was the smile he wore when he was confident he was winning, when he believed his version of events would prevail. Sarah had seen that smile increasingly over the past few months, each time she returned from a weekend visit to his house. And each time she saw it, her stomach twisted into knots. Also present in the gallery, though Sarah didn't know it yet, was Melissa Harrison, David's new girlfriend. Melissa was 36, attractive in a sharp-edged way, with perfectly styled brunette hair and designer clothes that probably cost more than everything Jennifer owned. Melissa had a habit of watching Sarah with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite name. It wasn't love or warmth. It was more analytical, as if Melissa were assessing Sarah's usefulness, calculating how best to use her. Melissa had been coaching Sarah for weeks, drilling her with questions, rewording her answers, making her practice what to say and what to avoid. These preparation sessions, as Melissa called them, made Sarah's head hurt. The courthouse itself was an imposing structure, all granite and marble and the weight of governmental authority. It had been built in the 1970s, and it carried the cold, impersonal aesthetic of that era. The hallway where Sarah now sat was lined with tall windows that allowed weak winter sunlight to filter through, creating long shadows on the floor. The air smelled of old wood, industrial cleaning products, and something else, something Sarah's young brain categorized as sadness. She'd never been here before, never been inside any courtroom, and the vastness of the space made her feel impossibly small. Over the past year, Sarah had watched her parents' marriage deteriorate from a distance at first, then with increasing clarity as things had escalated. There had been arguments late at night, her father's voice raised, her mother crying softly in the kitchen. There had been a period of cold silence where they barely spoke to each other. Then came the separation, her father moving into an apartment across town. She'd been relieved at first. The tension in the house had been unbearable. But relief had quickly transformed into confusion, then into guilt. Had she done something wrong? Had she caused this? Then came the custody arrangement, alternating weekends, scheduled phone calls, a careful choreography of pickups and drop-offs that made Sarah feel like a piece being moved around a board game. But recently, things had escalated further. Her father had hired a lawyer. Her mother had hired a lawyer. Now they were here, on what the judge's secretary had told them would be the trial day, though Sarah wasn't entirely sure what that meant. In her office chambers 2 floors above, the Honorable Patricia Chen was reviewing the case files. Judge Chen was a woman of 58 years old with steel-gray hair worn in a practical bob and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been on the bench for 23 years, and she'd seen thousands of cases. She'd learned to recognize patterns, to read between the lines of legal arguments, to understand what attorneys weren't saying as much as what they were. This case, Mitchell v. Mitchell, appeared straightforward on its surface. David Mitchell was requesting primary custody, claiming that his wife was emotionally unstable, prone to depression, and potentially unfit as a primary caregiver. Jennifer Mitchell, in her counterpetition, denied these allegations and argued that David was attempting to use his superior financial resources to manipulate the court system. Both parents claimed to have Sarah's best interests at heart. Both parents claimed to love her deeply. Judge Chen had been doing this long enough to know that such claims weren't necessarily mutually exclusive, with causing severe damage to a child. She'd learned that people could genuinely love their children while also being willing to hurt them in the pursuit of custody, control, or revenge. It was one of the sadder lessons her career had taught her. She glanced at the file again, noting the child psychologist's preliminary report. Dr. Michael Torres had interviewed Sarah and made some concerning observations about the child's anxiety levels and evasiveness, but his report wasn't definitive. Judge Chen made a mental note to pay particular attention to Sarah's testimony. The child's demeanor, her tone of voice, her body language, these things often revealed truths that words couldn't capture. Outside the courthouse, the morning was cold and gray, typical for late February. News vans were already lined up along the curb, journalists preparing for what they hoped would be a salacious story about a bitter custody battle. Custody cases didn't normally attract media attention unless there were allegations of abuse or infidelity or other sensational elements. The fact that there were no such allegations, yet the case was still generating interest, suggested that someone had leaked information to the press. Sarah, still sitting on that hard bench with Mr. Floppy clutched to her chest, didn't know that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. She didn't know that in the next few hours, she would be called upon to make impossible choices, to navigate between her love for her parents and her need to tell the truth. She didn't know that a moment of extraordinary courage would eventually reshape not just her life, but the lives of countless other children whose voices might otherwise have gone unheard. All she knew in that moment was that she was scared. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a frightened bird. Her mouth was dry. She had a terrible feeling that whatever happened in the next few hours was going to matter deeply, in ways she didn't fully understand but could sense with the intuition of a child who'd learned to read the emotional weather of adults with painful accuracy. Jennifer squeezed her hand one more time. "You'll be wonderful," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "Just tell the truth, okay? That's all you need to do." But Sarah knew, with a certainty that made her stomach churn, that telling the truth wasn't going to be that simple. The courtroom door opened with an ominous creak, and Sarah was led inside by a bailiff whose name she'd forgotten the moment he introduced himself. The space was even more imposing than she'd imagined from the hallway. High ceilings soared above her head, making her feel like an ant in a cathedral. Mahogany wood paneling covered the walls, and an enormous flag hung in one corner. The judge's bench loomed at the front of the room, elevated on a platform like a throne. Sarah's eyes found her mother in the gallery, and Jennifer gave her an encouraging smile, though her hands were clasped so tightly together her knuckles had turned white. The bailiff placed a hand gently on Sarah's shoulder and guided her toward the witness stand. It was a wooden box with a railing, positioned between the judge's bench and the rest of the courtroom. As she climbed the 2 small steps to reach it, Sarah felt every eye in the room watching her. She counted approximately 20 people present: the judge, the 2 attorneys, the court reporter whose fingers hovered over a strange machine, her parents, Melissa, and scattered others she didn't recognize. 20 sets of eyes tracking her every movement. "Please place your hand on the Bible," the bailiff said, his voice gentle in a way that suggested he'd done this many times with frightened children. He held out a worn leather Bible, its pages yellowed from age and use. Sarah's small hand looked impossibly fragile against its weathered cover. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the bailiff intoned, his words carrying the weight of centuries of judicial tradition. Sarah's throat felt like it had closed up. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. She cleared her throat quietly and tried again. "I do," she whispered, barely audible even in the silent courtroom. "You need to speak up, sweetie," the bailiff said kindly. "Can you say that again a little louder?" "I do," Sarah repeated, her voice slightly stronger but still small and uncertain. She took her seat in the witness stand, and the court reporter adjusted a microphone in front of her. Suddenly, Sarah's breathing sounded loud in the quiet room. She could hear the soft scratching of the court reporter's stylus on the stenotype machine. She could hear the rustle of papers as attorneys consulted their notes. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Mr. Preston, David's attorney, rose from his seat with a practiced grace that suggested years of courtroom experience. He was tall, probably 6 feet 2, and his expensive suit was perfectly tailored. He smiled at Sarah, a warm, grandfatherly smile that was clearly meant to put her at ease, but Sarah recognized it as a performance. She'd watched enough adults lately to know that smiles could hide darker intentions. "Sarah, how are you feeling today?" Mr. Preston asked, his voice gentle and conversational. "Okay," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good, good. I know being in court might feel a little scary, but I promise this will be over soon. All I'm going to do is ask you some questions, and all you need to do is answer them as honestly as you can. Does that sound fair?" Sarah nodded, then remembered that the court reporter might not be able to transcribe a nod. "Yes," she said softly. "Wonderful. Sarah, I want to start with a simple question. Do you love your daddy?" It was a trap disguised as a simple question. Sarah knew this. During her last weekend visit, her father and Melissa had spent hours preparing her for this exact question. They'd made her practice the answer over and over. They'd explained why this answer was important, how it was the foundation for everything else she would say. "Yes," Sarah answered, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I love my daddy." "That's wonderful. And do you love your mommy?" Another trap. She'd been coached on this too. The answer was yes, but it needed to be said with slightly less enthusiasm than her answer about her father. She needed to sound less certain, as if perhaps her love for her mother was more complicated. "Yes, but," she began, following the script that had been drilled into her head. "But what, Sarah?" Mr. Preston asked, leaning forward slightly as if her next words would be of tremendous importance. "But sometimes mommy is sad," Sarah said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "And when she's sad, she gets mean." In the gallery, Jennifer's face crumpled as if she'd been physically struck. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. Sarah felt a terrible surge of guilt, knowing she just said something untrue, knowing that her mother wasn't mean when she was sad. Her mother just went quiet and retreated into herself. "Tell me about a time when your mommy was mean to you," Mr. Preston continued, his voice still gentle but with an undertone of satisfaction. Sarah's mind went blank. She'd memorized specific examples during her coaching sessions with Melissa. There was the time her mother had raised her voice when Sarah spilled juice on the carpet. There was the time her mother had been late picking her up from school because she'd gotten stuck in traffic. Melissa had transformed these ordinary parental moments into evidence of instability and negligence. "One time I spilled juice on the carpet and Mommy yelled at me really loud," Sarah recited, the words emerging in a monotone. "It scared me. And one time Mommy forgot to pick me up at school and I had to wait a long time with the teacher." All of these things had happened, technically, but in the retelling, they sounded sinister, calculated proof of her mother's inadequacy. Sarah felt like a puppeteer's doll, her words coming from somewhere outside herself. "That must have been frightening for you," Mr. Preston said sympathetically. "Now, Sarah, I want to ask you about your father's home. When you stay with your father, do you feel safe?" "Yes," Sarah said, because that was what she'd been instructed to say. The truth was more complicated. She did feel safe at her father's house in some ways. He had a nice home, and he took her to restaurants and movies. But she also felt the constant pressure to say the right things, to perform the role he and Melissa had scripted for her. That pressure didn't feel safe at all. "And does your father provide you with everything you need?" Mr. Preston asked. "Yes," Sarah answered. "He buys me things and he takes me places and he helps me with homework." "What about your mother, Sarah? Does your mother have the resources to provide you with the same level of care?" Sarah knew the answer to this one too. Her mother worked as a dental hygienist, earning a modest income. Her father was a successful real estate developer with a much larger income. Melissa had made sure Sarah understood this discrepancy, had emphasized it repeatedly. "No," Sarah said quietly, "Mommy doesn't have as much money." "So your father can provide you with a more comfortable lifestyle?" Mr. Preston pressed. "Yes," Sarah replied. Judge Chen, sitting elevated above the courtroom, observed this exchange with increasing concern. She'd seen many child witnesses over her years on the bench, and something about this testimony didn't sit right. Sarah's answers were too rehearsed, too polished. A child of 8 typically used more natural language, more emotional embellishment. Sarah sounded like she was reading from a script, delivering lines she'd been forced to memorize. The judge noticed other things too. Sarah's hands trembled as she held Mr. Floppy in her lap. She'd been allowed to keep the stuffed rabbit despite courtroom protocol, because she looked so fragile that everyone involved had agreed to the exception. Sarah's eyes darted frequently toward her father, as if seeking approval or fearing disapproval. And underneath her answers was a quality that Judge Chen had come to recognize as coached compliance. The testimony of a child who was saying what adults had instructed her to say, rather than what she actually believed. "Now, Sarah, I'm going to ask you some questions about your mother's behavior," Mr. Preston continued. "Has your mother ever seemed sad or depressed to you?" "Yes," Sarah said. In this case, it was actually true. Her mother had seemed sad and withdrawn since the separation, which was understandable given the circumstances. "How often would you say your mother seems sad or depressed?" Sarah hesitated. She was supposed to say always or most of the time, but that would be a lie so obvious even she recognized its falseness. "Sometimes," she said, splitting the difference. "But you would say it's a significant problem, correct? That it affects her ability to care for you?" "Yes," Sarah said, following the pattern. But even as she spoke the word, she felt something inside her breaking. This wasn't right. This wasn't true. Her mother cared about her deeply. Her mother might be struggling, but that was because her father was being cruel, because he was taking her away, because of the stress of this very trial. A wave of nausea washed over her. Her hands began to shake more noticeably. The microphone picked up the tremor in her voice as she answered the next question, something about whether her father had ever done anything that scared her or made her uncomfortable. "No," she said, the lie burning her throat like fire. But it was a lie. Her father scared her sometimes. The way he looked at her when she got answers wrong during the coaching session scared her. The disappointment in his eyes when she stumbled over her lines scared her. The way he and Melissa had explained with clinical precision that she might have to choose to live with him and give up living with her mother, that scared her most of all. Mr. Preston continued questioning for another 30 minutes. With each answer, Sarah felt herself disappearing, replaced by this false version of herself that he and Melissa had constructed. She answered questions about her mother's supposed instability, about her father's superior care, about her own preferences for living primarily with her father. By the time he said, "I have no further questions for this witness at this time," Sarah felt hollowed out like a shell with nothing inside. She'd done what they'd asked her to do, she'd testified, but some essential part of her, the truthful part, the part that knew right from wrong, felt damaged, contaminated. She didn't yet know that this moment, as terrible as it was, would lead to something transformative. She didn't know that sometimes hitting rock bottom is the only way back to the surface. All she knew was that she'd betrayed the person she loved most, and nothing would ever be the same. Sarah sat in the witness stand, her small frame seeming to shrink further into itself as the cross-examination began. The microphone captured every shallow breath, every nervous swallow. Mrs. Sarah Chen, the mother's attorney, no relation to the judge, approached the stand with a demeanor entirely different from Mr. Preston's grandfatherly warmth. She was a woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked black hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen too much human suffering to accept lies gracefully. "Sarah, I'm Mrs. Chen and I represent your mother," she said, her voice kind but with an undertone of careful scrutiny. "I'd like to ask you some questions about what you've just told the court. Is that okay?" Sarah's throat constricted. She nodded, then remembered to speak. "Yes," she whispered. "Now, earlier, you told Mr. Preston that your mother yelled at you when you spilled juice on the carpet. Is that correct?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "How many times has your mother yelled at you?" Mrs. Chen asked. Sarah's mind raced. She'd only prepared for one specific example. No one had prepared her for follow-up questions that required her to elaborate on the script. I don't remember exactly," Sarah said, her voice wavering. "Maybe a few times." "A few times? You said earlier that your mother gets mean when she's sad and that this happens regularly. So would you say it's more than a few times?" Sarah felt sweat beginning to bead on her forehead. In the gallery, David's face had gone completely still, a statue of concentration. Melissa leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. Sarah could feel their attention like a physical weight. I don't know," Sarah said, her voice becoming even quieter. "Can you tell me about another time your mother yelled at you, a specific incident?" Sarah's mind went blank. She'd memorized the juice incident and the late pickup at school, but nothing else had been prepared. There was that time her mother had raised her voice when Sarah had talked back to her, but that had been Sarah's fault. There was the time her mother had been frustrated when Sarah had come home with a note from school about not listening in class, but that was also Sarah's responsibility, wasn't it? I can't remember another time," Sarah finally admitted. Mrs. Chen didn't press the point. Instead, she moved on to another line of questioning. "Sarah, you mentioned that your mother forgot to pick you up at school. How long did you have to wait?" "A really long time," Sarah said, the rehearsed answer emerging automatically. "How long is a really long time? 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour?" Sarah's hands began to shake in her lap, Mr. Floppy trembling with them. Maybe like 20 minutes," she said uncertainly. And you remember this as a traumatic experience. Yes, Sarah said, but even to her own ears the answer sounded doubtful. Sarah, has your mother ever left you alone without supervision? Has she ever abandoned you? No, Sarah said. Has she ever been late picking you up from school before, or since that incident you mentioned? Sarah thought hard, trying to remember. Had her mother ever been late again? She couldn't recall another specific instance. There was the time they'd had to wait a bit longer than expected, but that was because Sarah had been in the bathroom and made them late getting out to the parking lot. That wasn't her mother's fault at all. No, I don't think so, Sarah said. So out of all the times your mother has picked you up from school, she's been late just that one time. The trap was becoming clearer to Sarah. She was being forced to confront the unreliability of her own testimony, the way her answers had been shaped by adults with an agenda rather than by actual reality. She felt tears beginning to prick at her eyes. Yes, she said softly. Mrs. Chen continued, her questions becoming more specific, more challenging to the narrative that Mr. Preston had so carefully constructed. You said your mother seems sad or depressed. Does she ever spend time with you and engage in activities you enjoy? Sarah's resolve began to crack. Images flooded her mind of her mother taking her to the library, of her mother braiding her hair while singing off-key, of her mother curling up next to her on the couch to read books together, of her mother's face lighting up when Sarah came home from school. Yes, Sarah admitted quietly, she does lots of things with me. So despite being sad sometimes, your mother is still involved in your life and your care. Yes, Sarah said, and with that single word she felt something inside her shift. This was the truth. Her mother, despite her struggles, loved her deeply and cared for her well. Judge Chen leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes moving between Sarah and the attorneys. She was beginning to see the picture more clearly, a child caught between two competing narratives, being forced to choose between her love for her parents and her need to speak truthfully. Sarah, I want to ask you something very important, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, Mrs. Chen said, moving closer to the witness stand. Before this trial, did anyone spend a lot of time asking you questions about your mother, preparing you for what you might say in court? Sarah's entire body went rigid. This was the question she'd been coached to avoid. Melissa had spent an entire session explaining that if anyone asked this, Sarah should deny it firmly. You just say no, Melissa had instructed, her voice sharp. You don't mention our preparation time. That's our private time together, and you don't discuss it with anyone. Sarah opened her mouth to lie, but something inside her rebelled. She thought about the hours of drilling, the way Melissa's face would tighten when Sarah got an answer wrong, the way her father would watch with approval when she said what they'd prepared her to say. She thought about her mother's face in the gallery, crumpling with hurt at each false testimony. Yes, Sarah whispered, and the word came out like a confession, like a dam breaking. The courtroom erupted in a subtle rustling of movement. Journalists in the back leaned forward eagerly, sensing blood in the water. Mr. Preston shot out of his seat. Objection, he called out. Counsel is leading the witness. I want to hear this, Judge Chen interrupted, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Continue, Mrs. Chen. Who spent time preparing you? Mrs. Chen asked gently. Sarah's hands shook so violently that Mr. Floppy fell from her lap. She watched him tumble to the floor of the witness stand, and she wanted to cry out, wanted to scramble after him, wanted to hide. But she forced herself to stay seated, forced herself to answer. My dad and Melissa, she said, her voice barely audible through the microphone. How many times did they ask you questions? A lot, Sarah said, tears now streaming down her face. They asked me the same questions over and over, and when I got the answers wrong, they would get mad and make me do it again until I said it the right way. Jennifer gasped in the gallery, her hand flying to her mouth. David's face flushed a deep red, and he gripped Mr. Preston's arm, whispering something urgently. Melissa had gone pale, her perfectly composed exterior cracking. "Sarah, did they tell you what to say?" Mrs. Chen pressed. "Yes," Sarah sobbed now, the tears flowing freely. "They told me to say Mommy gets mean and that she's sad all the time and that I want to live with Daddy, but that's not true. Mommy isn't mean. She loves me and I don't want to not live with her. I love her." The words came pouring out now, a torrent of truth after weeks of carefully constructed lies. Sarah's entire body shook with the force of her sobs. Judge Chen immediately signaled to the bailiff. "We need to take a break," the judge announced, her voice carrying an edge of controlled fury. "Sarah, would you like some water? And Mr. Floppy needs to be retrieved." The bailiff gently picked up the stuffed rabbit and brought it back to Sarah, who clutched it like a lifeline. A court officer brought her a cup of water, which she drank gratefully, her hands shaking so badly the cup clattered against her teeth. In that moment, Sarah felt simultaneously broken and relieved. She told the truth, finally, but the cost of that truth felt enormous. She'd betrayed her father's trust, or had she? She'd made Melissa angry, but shouldn't she be angry? She'd hurt Mr. Preston's carefully constructed case, but his case was built on lies. The most confusing emotion, though, was the weight of responsibility. She was 8 years old, and yet in the span of a few hours, the entire trajectory of the trial had shifted based on her testimony. Adults were supposed to protect children, to shield them from adult problems. Instead, her parents, both of them, had tried to use her as a weapon in their battle against each other. Judge Chen sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable, but her eyes blazed with determination. She was already formulating her next moves, already planning how to protect this child who had been caught in the crossfire of adult selfishness and ambition. The courtroom fell silent except for Sarah's quiet sobs and the rustling of papers as attorneys urgently consulted with each other. Everyone in that room understood that something significant had just happened. The neat narrative that Mr. Preston had constructed had shattered like glass, revealing the painful truth beneath. Sarah sat in the witness stand, Mr. Floppy clutched to her chest, wondering if she just made everything better or everything worse. The courtroom had settled into a tense silence after Sarah's emotional outburst, though the air still crackled with the electric charge of her confession. Judge Chen had called for a 15-minute recess to allow Sarah to compose herself, and for the attorneys to confer with their respective clients. During that break, the gallery had erupted into hushed conversations. Journalists scribbled furiously on notepads. A woman Sarah didn't recognize was on her phone, speaking rapidly about coached testimony and potential perjury charges. When everyone had reassembled, the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. What had been a straightforward custody case was now something far more serious, a case involving potential child abuse, manipulation, and coached perjury. Judge Chen sat at her bench with the expression of someone who had witnessed something troubling and was determining how to respond to it. Mr. Preston approached the bench to confer quietly with the judge. Sarah watched from the witness stand, which she'd been instructed to remain in during the recess. Even from a distance, she could hear the tension in Mr. Preston's voice. He was arguing something, gesturing emphatically, but Judge Chen shook her head firmly. Whatever he was proposing, the judge was rejecting it. "The witness will remain available for further questioning," Judge Chen declared, her voice brooking no argument. "We are going to establish exactly what coaching and preparation occurred." Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. More questioning, more opportunities to lie or tell the truth, more opportunities to hurt someone. She clutched Mr. Floppy so tightly the stuffing inside compressed. The rabbit's button eyes seemed to judge her silently. Mr. Preston, recognizing that the judge was now firmly against him, took a different approach. He decided to try to rehabilitate his client's case by asking Sarah questions designed to minimize the significance of the coaching, or to suggest that Sarah had misunderstood or exaggerated what had occurred. Sarah, when you say your father and Melissa asked you questions, they were just trying to prepare you for court, weren't they? He asked, his tone suggesting this was a perfectly reasonable and normal thing to do. Objection, Mrs. Chen said sharply, leading. Sustained, Judge Chen agreed, and Sarah noticed the judge's expression had hardened further against Mr. Preston. Sarah, can you tell the court what your father and Melissa told you about the questions they were asking you? Sarah took a shaky breath. She could feel her father watching her intently from the gallery. She could feel the weight of his expectation, his disappointment, his anger at her betrayal. But she also felt something else, a quiet determination that had grown from her recent confession. She had started telling the truth. She would continue to tell it. They said that the judge needed to hear that Mommy wasn't taking care of me right, Sarah said slowly, choosing her words with the careful precision of a child who'd learned that words had power. They said that if I told the judge the right things, then I could live with Daddy all the time. They said Mommy was sad and broken, and that I would be better off with Daddy. But you love your father, don't you? Mr. Preston pressed, trying to find some way to salvage his case. Yes, Sarah said, but I also love my Mommy, and what you and Daddy and Melissa did was wrong. You made me say things that weren't true. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which was precisely what they were. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to stop moving, her fingers frozen above her stenotype machine. It was in that moment of profound silence that something shifted in Sarah's awareness. She had been focused on the questioning, on the attorneys, on trying to navigate the minefield of truth and lies. But now, as she sat in the witness stand with her heart pounding, she became acutely aware of something else, a presence in the gallery that had been troubling her all morning. She glanced toward the back of the gallery, where Melissa sat. The younger woman's face had flushed a deep crimson. Her jaw was clenched, and her eyes bore into Sarah with an intensity that was almost physical. It was the same look she'd given Sarah during the coaching sessions when Sarah got an answer wrong. The look of someone who viewed Sarah as a tool, and tools were meant to perform their function correctly or be discarded. And in that moment, Sarah remembered something crucial. She remembered a conversation with her mother that had taken place just 3 days before this trial, on a Thursday evening when Sarah had come home from her father's house with anxiety etched into every fiber of her being. She remembered her mother holding her, asking her gentle questions about what was wrong, about whether she felt pressured during her visits with her father. Sarah had broken down then too, confessing the coaching, the rehearsal, the pressure to say specific things. Her mother had been heartbroken but also practical. She'd explained to Sarah that sometimes, when adults were fighting, they might ask children to do things that weren't right. She'd explained that if Sarah ever felt like she couldn't speak the truth because she was afraid or being pressured, she should use a signal. What kind of signal? Sarah had asked, her small voice trembling. Her mother had thought for a moment, then had taken Sarah's hand. This, she'd said, and she tapped Sarah's hand twice, tap, tap, then once, tap, then twice again, tap, tap. That will mean I'm scared and I need help. I'm not being honest because I'm afraid. Our secret signal. If you ever do that, I'll know and I'll help you no matter what. Sarah had practiced it with her mother several times, the pattern becoming ingrained in her muscle memory. It was a lifeline, her mother had explained. Something that adults might miss, but that would be there if she needed it. And now, as Sarah sat in the witness stand, as she felt the pressure and judgment from everyone around her, as she watched Melissa's face radiate silent fury and threats, Sarah knew it was time to use that signal. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, but it felt suspended in time, as if everything slowed down. Sarah looked directly at Melissa, a deliberate, defiant look, as if to say, I see you, and I'm not afraid anymore. Then she slowly raised her left hand and pressed it deliberately against the wooden edge of the witness box. Tab, tab. The sound was quiet but distinctive, captured by the courtroom's excellent acoustics and the microphone positioned near the witness stand. Sarah paused, counting to 3 in her head, then continued. Tap. Another pause. Tap, tap. The pattern was complete. Her secret signal, the one her mother had taught her, was now part of the official court record, immortalized by the court reporter's stenotype machine. For a moment, nothing happened. The attorneys continued gathering their papers as if the tapping had been nothing more than nervous fidgeting. The gallery remained silent. But then Sarah saw her mother's entire body go rigid. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes widened with a recognition that only someone who knew the pattern would have. Tears immediately streamed down her face. Judge Chen, who had been reviewing documents on her bench, lifted her head sharply. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, moved from Sarah to Jennifer to the spot where Sarah had tapped the witness box. She'd been a judge for over 2 decades. She'd presided over thousands of cases. She knew that some of the most important communications in a courtroom were the ones that occurred in silence, in small gestures, in the spaces between words. The judge stood up slowly, her expression transforming from judicial detachment to something far more purposeful. She'd seen something, a gesture, a pattern, a moment of connection, that told her everything she needed to know about what was happening in her courtroom. "We are taking a recess," Judge Chen announced, her voice cutting through the room like thunder. 15 minutes. "Your Honor, I'd like to request," Mr. Preston began. Judge Chen raised one hand, silencing him with a gesture. Her eyes remained fixed on Sarah, and in those eyes, Sarah saw something she desperately needed to see: understanding, protection, and the determination to do what was right. "Sarah will come with me to my chambers," the judge said, her tone making clear that this was not a request. "Alone, everyone else remain in the courtroom." As Sarah climbed down from the witness stand, Mr. Floppy tucked securely under her arm, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She'd made a choice. She'd used her signal. She'd communicated to her mother and apparently to the judge that something was deeply wrong with this entire proceeding. As the bailiff guided her toward the judge's private chambers, Sarah glanced back at her father. His face had gone completely white, his jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscles working beneath the skin. He looked angry and afraid in equal measure. But Sarah also glanced at her mother, and through her tears, Jennifer was smiling, a smile of pride, relief, and love. It was the expression of a parent who had watched her child find the courage to tell the truth, even when the cost was potentially everything. Sarah didn't yet understand the full implications of what she'd just done. She didn't know that Judge Chen's sharp eyes had caught not just the signal, but also Jennifer's reaction, a reaction that revealed this was no random gesture. She didn't know that she just set in motion events that would fundamentally change the trajectory of her life and the lives of everyone in that courtroom. All she knew was that she'd done something brave, and that for once, finally, she felt like someone in this room was actually on her side. The walk from the courtroom to Judge Chen's private chambers seemed to take both an eternity and no time at all. Sarah's small hand was held gently but securely by the bailiff, whose name she'd learned was Officer Williams. He was a large man with a kind face, and he moved slowly enough that Sarah didn't have to rush. Behind them, Judge Chen walked with a purposeful stride, her black robe flowing behind her like the wings of a determined bird of prey. The hallway outside the courtroom was marble and wood, lined with portraits of judges from decades past. Sarah tried not to look at their stern expressions as they passed. She clutched Mr. Floppy so tightly that her fingers ached. What had she done? What would happen now? Her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage, and her palms were so sweaty that she was afraid she might drop her beloved rabbit. Judge Chen's chambers were nothing like the cold, formal courtroom. The space was warm and surprisingly human. Books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves on one wall, their spines in various colors creating a kind of rainbow effect. There were photographs on the desk, Judge Chen with 2 adult children, Judge Chen at the beach, Judge Chen at what appeared to be a law school graduation. A comfortable-looking chair sat near the window with a cozy throw draped over it. The afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. "Officer Williams, could you please wait outside?" Judge Chen asked, her voice warm but carrying absolute authority. "Close the door behind you but remain available if I need you." "Yes, Your Honor," Officer Williams responded. He released Sarah's hand gently. "You're safe now, Sarah," he said softly, with a kindness that made fresh tears spring to her eyes. Then he was gone, the heavy wooden door closing with a soft click. Judge Chen turned to face Sarah fully, and then she did something that Sarah didn't expect. Instead of sitting in her imposing judge's chair, she pulled up a smaller chair and sat down at eye level with Sarah, their faces only about 2 feet apart. This simple gesture, this choice to position herself as an equal rather than as an authority figure, immediately made Sarah feel less terrified. "Sarah, my name is Patricia Chen," the judge said, her voice gentle and maternal. "I'm going to be very honest with you about what's happening right now because I believe you deserve honesty. Can you handle that?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. I'm a judge, which means my job is to figure out what's true and what's right and to make decisions that protect people, especially children. What I saw in that courtroom today was a very brave little girl who, after saying things that weren't true, things she was coached to say, found the courage to tell the truth instead. And then just now you made a signal that only you and your mother understood. Am I right?" Sarah's eyes widened. She hadn't been entirely sure the judge had understood what the signal meant. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "I want you to know that I caught that signal and I understood its importance. Your mother's reaction told me everything I needed to know. You were communicating something to your mother, something important. Something about your safety or your honesty, correct?" Sarah felt tears beginning to overflow down her cheeks. Someone understood. Someone finally actually understood what was happening. "I want to know what that signal means," Judge Chen continued, her voice steady and calm. "But more importantly, I want to know what happened in your father's home. I want to know about the coaching, about how they prepared you, about how you felt. And I want you to know that whatever you tell me, you will not be in trouble. You are not the problem here, Sarah. The adults who put you in this position are the problem. Do you understand?" "Yes," Sarah said, her voice small but steady. "Take your time. There's no rush. Drink some water if you need to." Judge Chen gestured to a glass pitcher on a side table with several cups arranged beside it. "And I want you to know that everything you tell me will help me understand what's really going on. It will help me protect you and make sure that adults who are supposed to love and protect you don't use you to hurt each other. Okay?" For the next 30 minutes, Sarah talked. The story poured out of her in a combination of words, tears, and silences, where she struggled to articulate the emotional complexity of what she'd experienced. She described the coaching sessions with Melissa, how they'd start gently but escalate into pressure and criticism when Sarah didn't deliver answers exactly as they'd been rehearsed. She described how her father and Melissa had worked together to reshape her memories, suggesting alternative narratives for events that had actually been innocent. She described how they'd made her feel that her love for her mother was a betrayal of her father, how they'd suggested that her mother was unstable and unfit, how they'd explained that Sarah would be better off in her father's home with all its material comforts. She described the way Melissa's face would harden when Sarah struggled with the script, the way her father would look at her with disappointment when she got an answer wrong. She described the implicit threats, that if Sarah didn't cooperate, her mother would be taken away from her, that she'd have to choose between her parents, that choosing her mother would mean losing her father completely. Judge Chen listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, her expression reflecting both anger at the adults involved and compassion for the child suffering the consequences of their actions. She made detailed notes, her pen moving across legal pads with the precision of someone documenting evidence. When Sarah had finished, Judge Chen set down her pen and looked at the child with an expression of profound determination. Sarah, I want you to listen to me very carefully, the judge said. What your father and Melissa did was wrong. Coaching you to lie under oath, manipulating you emotionally, using you as a weapon in their conflict. Those are serious, serious violations. Not violations of you as a person, but violations of the law. I need you to understand that this is not your fault. You are not bad. You are not in trouble. You are a brave, honest child who was put in an impossible position by adults who were not behaving responsibly. Sarah's lower lip trembled. Is Daddy going to be mad at me? Your father may be unhappy with the choices you've made, but that's his responsibility to manage appropriately, not yours to manage for him, Judge Chen said firmly. And more importantly, I am going to make sure that you are protected. You will not be pressured or punished for telling the truth. Judge Chen picked up her phone and pressed a button. Betty, I need you to do something for me. Please contact Child Protective Services and request an immediate investigation into potential child endangerment and emotional abuse. The case details are Mitchell versus Mitchell, case number 2024 CV47832. I want them to know this is urgent, and I'm personally concerned about the child's welfare. Also, please have our clerk prepare documentation for potential charges of witness tampering and perjury. The accused is David Mitchell and Melissa Harrison. Yes, I understand it's late in the day. This is a priority. Judge Chen hung up and turned back to Sarah. I'm going to go back into that courtroom, and I'm going to make some decisions that are going to protect you. Your mother is going to have custody of you while we investigate what happened. Your father will have supervised visitation only, and there will be an investigation into whether criminal charges should be filed. But will my daddy go to jail? Sarah asked, her voice small. That will depend on many factors and ultimately on how he responds to what's happened and what the investigation reveals, Judge Chen said honestly. But what I want you to focus on right now is this. You are safe. You did the right thing by telling the truth, and there are adults in the system, like me, who will work to make sure you're protected going forward. Judge Chen stood up and extended her hand to Sarah. Are you ready to go back to the courtroom? Sarah looked at her stuffed rabbit at this judge who had taken time to sit with her and listen and believe her, and she felt something shift inside her. She was still scared. She was still worried about her father and what would happen next, but she also felt something new, a sense that she was not alone in this fight, that there were people in positions of power who cared about her welfare and would fight for her. Yes, Sarah said, taking Judge Chen's hand. I'm ready. As they walked back toward the courtroom, Sarah held her head a little higher. The judge had told her she was brave. For the first time in weeks, Sarah was beginning to believe it. The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed during the recess. What had been a room buzzing with whispered speculation had become a pressure cooker of tension and anxiety. Journalists in the gallery were frantically typing notes and texting updates to their news desks. Court officers stood at attention, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The attorneys huddled with their respective clients, their voices urgent and low. David's face was ashen, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He kept glancing at the door through which Sarah had disappeared, his leg bouncing with nervous energy beneath the table. Melissa sat beside him, her perfect composure shattered. Her hands were clenched into fists, her jaw tight with barely controlled rage. Mr. Preston looked grim, already calculating the damage to his case and his reputation. Jennifer sat on the other side of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the door. Tears still streamed down her face, but now they were tears of hope mixed with fear. Mrs. Chen stood beside her, her expression serious but confident. They had exchanged very few words during the recess, but Jennifer had whispered, "She did it. She told the truth. Oh God, she actually did it." When the bailiff announced, "All rise," the Honorable Judge Patricia Chen, the entire courtroom stood. But Judge Chen was not alone. Sarah was beside her, still holding Mr. Floppy, still looking small and fragile but somehow more centered than before. The child took her seat in the gallery next to her mother, and Jennifer immediately wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Judge Chen mounted the bench with a presence that seemed to fill the entire room. Her expression was thunderous, barely controlled fury wrapped in judicial authority. She removed her glasses, rubbed her eyes, then replaced them with a gesture that suggested what she was about to say required her full clarity of vision. The courtroom fell completely silent, everyone sensing that they were about to witness something significant. "This court is going to make some immediate determinations," Judge Chen announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And I am issuing several orders that will take effect immediately." Mr. Preston stood. "Your Honor, if I may." Judge Chen raised one hand, silencing him with a gesture that was neither angry nor loud, but which nonetheless made clear that his input was not welcome. "I have spent the last 30 minutes speaking privately with the minor in this case," the judge continued. "What that child has revealed to me is deeply troubling and, frankly, deeply disturbing. I am now going to tell this courtroom exactly what I've learned, because transparency in cases involving child safety is paramount." She looked directly at Sarah, who was watching her with a mixture of fear and hope. Sarah Mitchell has confirmed that she was extensively coached and prepared to provide false testimony in this proceeding. This coaching occurred over a period of several weeks and involved both her father, David Mitchell, and his partner, Melissa Harrison. This was not casual preparation. This was systematic manipulation designed to force a child to lie under oath. Gasps erupted in the gallery. Journalists leaned forward eagerly, their phones recording every word. One woman in the gallery actually stood up, prompting a court officer to gesture for her to sit back down. The minor has described a pattern of emotional manipulation, implicit threats, and psychological coercion designed to make her feel that providing false testimony was necessary and desirable. Judge Chen continued, her voice steady and controlled. She was made to feel that she was betraying her father if she didn't provide the specific answers that had been drilled into her. She was told that if she didn't cooperate, her mother would be taken away from her. She was made to feel responsible for her father's happiness and for the outcome of this trial. David's face had gone from ashen to a blotchy red. He leaned toward Mr. Preston, whispering frantically, but the attorney was already shaking his head, his expression grim. "Based on this information and on my observations of the minor's testimony, I am making the following determinations," Judge Chen said. "First, the custody arrangement as previously established is immediately suspended. The minor will be placed in the custody of her mother, Jennifer Mitchell, effective immediately. There will be no overnight visitation, with the father pending the outcome of further investigation." Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth, and she pulled Sarah closer. Sarah watched her mother's face transform with relief and joy, and she felt tears of her own spilling down her cheeks. "Secondly, I am ordering supervised visitation only for David Mitchell. Any contact between the minor and her father will occur in the presence of a court-appointed supervisor. This is to ensure the child's safety and to prevent any further attempts at manipulation or coaching." "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Mr. Preston began. "Sit down, Mr. Preston," Judge Chen said sharply. "You and your client are about to learn that what they've done is far more serious than a custody dispute. Third, I am immediately suspending these proceedings pending a full investigation by Child Protective Services. This is no longer simply a family law matter. This has escalated to issues of child endangerment and potential abuse." The courtroom erupted into whispered conversations. The judge waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "Fourth, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges against David Mitchell and Melissa Harrison for witness tampering, perjury, child endangerment, and psychological coercion of a minor. The specific details of the coaching, the implicit threats, and the manipulation that the minor has described to me in chambers constitute serious crimes." Melissa stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed. We were simply preparing. Ms. Harrison, you will sit down immediately or you will be held in contempt of court, Judge Chen said, her eyes cutting toward the woman like steel. Melissa immediately sat, her face flushed with rage. The minor has demonstrated extraordinary courage in coming forward with the truth despite intense pressure to remain silent, Judge Chen continued. She has violated the expectations of adults who should have been protecting her, and she has done so at significant emotional cost to herself. This child understands, at 8 years old, something that should be fundamental to all adults: the importance of truth and integrity. The judge's eyes moved around the courtroom, making contact with various people as if assessing their character. I have seen many things in my years on this bench. I have seen custody disputes that were bitter and ugly, but I have rarely seen a case where an adult was willing to so systematically manipulate a child in service of their own agenda. This court will not tolerate such behavior. Judge Chen addressed the bailiff. Please ensure that Mr. Mitchell and Ms. Harrison do not leave the courthouse. I am instructing the bailiff to coordinate with law enforcement regarding these individuals, pending the district attorney's determination on charges. David's lawyer gripped his arm, whispering urgently. David looked like a man whose entire world had collapsed, which, in a very real sense, it had. To the minor, Judge Chen said, turning her full attention to Sarah, I want to say something directly to you. You showed extraordinary bravery today. You were faced with a choice between loyalty to an adult you love and telling the truth. You chose truth, even knowing it would have serious consequences for your father. That took tremendous courage. You should be proud of yourself. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as her mother held her tight. She heard several women in the gallery openly weeping. Even the court reporter seemed to have tears in her eyes. There will be follow-up sessions with Dr. Patricia Reeves, our court-appointed child psychologist, to help this minor process the trauma of this experience, Judge Chen said. The costs of this therapy will be borne by the father, as will the costs of any ongoing counseling the child requires. Judge Chen struck her gavel once, a decisive blow that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. These proceedings are adjourned indefinitely, pending the completion of the CPS investigation and the district attorney's review. This court stands in recess. The gavel fell again, and immediately the courtroom erupted. Journalists rushed toward the exits, phones to their ears, shouting to get their stories out. Court officers moved to ensure that David and Melissa remained seated. Mr. Preston looked like a man in shock, his carefully constructed case demolished in a matter of minutes. But in the center of it all was Sarah, held securely in her mother's arms, watching as the adult world took responsibility for its failures. She felt her mother's lips press against the top of her head, felt the trembling in Jennifer's body as she held her daughter close. You did it, Jennifer whispered over and over. You did it. You were so brave. I'm so proud of you. Outside the courthouse, news vans scrambled to capture footage as attorneys and witnesses made their way out. By that evening, the story would be the lead on every local news broadcast. Child testifies to coaching in custody case. Judge orders investigation. By the next morning, it would be trending on social media. By the end of the week, legal scholars would be discussing the case as a landmark decision in protecting children's rights in custody disputes. But for Sarah in that moment, what mattered most was simple. Her mother was holding her, telling her she was brave, and an adult in power had finally, definitively, taken her side. The news that evening led with Sarah's story. Local judge shuts down custody trial after discovering child was coached to lie, the headlines read. Social media exploded with commentary about parental manipulation, child protection laws, and Judge Patricia Chen's decisive action. Legal experts weighed in on what her decision meant for future custody cases. Child advocacy groups called her ruling groundbreaking. But while the media celebrated, Sarah was struggling with the reality of what her courage had cost her. That first night back at her mother's house, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed in the darkness, Mr. Floppy clutched to her chest, listening to her mother moving around the kitchen below, probably trying to process the day's events as much as Sarah was. The fear was immense. What would her father do? Would he hate her? Would he try to take her back to court? Would he punish her somehow? Her 8-year-old mind couldn't comprehend the full legal ramifications of what had happened, but she understood one thing. She had destroyed her father's plans, and there would be consequences. Jennifer came into the room around midnight, finding Sarah awake, tears streaming down her face in the darkness. "Oh, sweetheart," Jennifer whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I know today was overwhelming. I know you're scared." "Is Daddy going to hate me?" Sarah asked, her voice small and broken. "Oh, honey, no," Jennifer said, though her voice wavered slightly. She wasn't certain herself. "Your father loves you. He's angry right now and he's scared, but what he's feeling isn't your responsibility to manage. You did the right thing. You told the truth." "But I hurt him," Sarah said. "He's going to jail and it's because of me." This was the cruel irony of Sarah's situation. She'd been manipulated by her father, and now she felt guilty for the consequences of his own illegal actions. Jennifer held her daughter close, understanding that this emotional untangling would take a long time. "Your father made choices that hurt people," Jennifer said gently. "Bad choices. You didn't make those choices. You just told the truth about them. That's very different." Over the next week, the district attorney's office moved with surprising speed. Sarah had to provide a formal statement to a detective, a kind woman named Detective Martinez who specialized in child interviews. The process was thorough but gentle, designed to extract the detailed information needed for criminal charges while minimizing re-traumatization to the child. Sarah described every detail she could remember, the specific questions she'd been drilled on, the way Melissa's face would harden when she got answers wrong, the way her father had explained that the testimony was necessary to keep her from being taken away by a crazy mother. She described the subtle threats, the implicit pressure, the feeling of being trapped between impossible choices. Each time she recounted these details, she felt the weight of guilt and shame, even though intellectually she understood she'd done nothing wrong. Detective Martinez was patient and kind, explaining repeatedly that Sarah was helping to protect other children, that her bravery was going to make sure adults didn't try to manipulate children in this way in the future. 2 weeks after the trial shut down, the district attorney's office filed formal charges. David Mitchell was charged with witness tampering, child endangerment, and psychological coercion of a minor. Melissa Harrison faced similar charges. The news hit the media like a bombshell, and suddenly Sarah's father's name was in every news story, described as a man who had orchestrated a scheme to manipulate his own daughter into lying under oath. The coverage was extensive, sometimes sympathetic to Sarah and sometimes questioning the judge's decisions. Some legal commentators praised the ruling as revolutionary in child protection law. Others questioned whether a single judge should have that much power to make such dramatic determinations without more complete investigation. But what everyone agreed on was that this was significant, unprecedented, and changing the conversation around custody disputes and child protection. For Sarah, the publicity was overwhelming. She didn't have social media, but she was old enough to understand that people were talking about her. Kids at school whispered about the girl from the court case. Some were sympathetic, some were curious, some were cruel, suggesting that she'd betrayed her father or that she'd caused all the family drama. The school counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, was instrumental in helping Sarah navigate these social dynamics. 3 times a week, Sarah would spend time in Mrs. Rodriguez's office, a space decorated with comfortable furniture, plants, and soothing colors. Mrs. Rodriguez helped Sarah understand that what other people said wasn't her responsibility, that she'd done something brave and right, and that the cruelty of peers was a reflection of their own immaturity and confusion, not a reflection of Sarah's character. But the most important part of Sarah's healing came from her weekly sessions with Dr. Patricia Reeves, the court-appointed child psychologist. Dr. Reeves was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an unhurried manner. She created a space where Sarah could process the trauma she'd experienced, not just the coaching and manipulation, but the entire custody dispute and its emotional toll. "What you experienced is called emotional abuse," Dr. Reeves explained gently during one session. "It's when adults use psychological tactics to control a child's thoughts and feelings. It's very real and it causes real damage. But here's what's important to understand. The fact that you recognized it was wrong, that you had the courage to tell the truth despite the pressure, that shows tremendous strength." Sarah was learning, gradually, to separate her love for her father from her understanding that he had behaved wrongly toward her. It was a complex emotional landscape for an 8-year-old to navigate, but Dr. Reeves was patient and skilled at meeting her where she was developmentally. Meanwhile, the legal system continued its grinding forward motion. David and Melissa retained attorneys, expensive ones, and the case crawled through the criminal justice system. Both initially maintained their innocence, though the evidence was overwhelming. There were text messages between them discussing coaching strategies. There was the testimony from Dr. Torres, the court-appointed child psychologist, about Sarah's anxiety levels and evasiveness. There was Sarah's own detailed statement and her testimony, delivered this time with proper support systems in place. 3 months after the trial shut down, David Mitchell made a deal. He accepted a plea agreement that included charges of witness tampering and child endangerment. He agreed to extensive therapy, parenting classes, and a supervised visitation arrangement. In exchange, charges of psychological coercion were dropped. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with credit for time served and possibilities for early release with good behavior. Melissa Harrison fought the charges harder, maintaining her innocence and claiming she'd simply been helping Sarah prepare for court as any caring step-parent might. But the evidence was too strong, the testimony too detailed, and eventually her attorney advised her to accept a plea deal as well. She accepted a charge of witness tampering and received a sentence of 12 months in prison. For Sarah, the news of her father's imprisonment was complicated. Part of her felt relief. He wouldn't be able to pressure her or coach her or threaten her anymore. But part of her was devastated. He was still her father. The love she felt for him didn't disappear because of his crimes. She grieved for the relationship she'd lost, for the father who should have been there for her but instead had harmed her. Judge Chen requested a follow-up report on Sarah's well-being 6 months after her decision. Dr. Reeves submitted a detailed assessment describing a child who was healing, who was processing trauma appropriately, and who was showing signs of remarkable resilience. Judge Chen read the report in her chambers one afternoon and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The decision she'd made that day had been right. The child was being protected. The system was working, albeit imperfectly. Sarah received letters from her father while he was in prison, carefully screened by the court for any inappropriate content. In these letters, David expressed remorse for what he'd done. He described his own therapy, his gradual understanding of how his actions had harmed his daughter, his commitment to building a different kind of relationship with her when his time was served. Sarah read these letters with mixed emotions. She wanted to believe her father was genuinely sorry. She wanted their relationship to be salvageable. But she also understood, with a maturity far beyond her years, that trust, once broken, takes a long time to rebuild. 6 months after the trial, Sarah was sleeping better. She was laughing more. She was beginning to understand that what happened to her was not her fault, that she'd been a victim of adult manipulation, but that her act of courage had transformed her from a victim into a survivor. The nightmares came less frequently. The anxiety attacks were less severe. She was, slowly but surely, reclaiming her life. 5 years later, on a warm June afternoon, Sarah Mitchell stood in her cap and gown, waiting to walk across the stage at Lincoln High School's graduation ceremony. She was no longer the fragile 8-year-old who had sat in a witness stand. terrified and torn between loyalty and truth. At 13, she was poised, confident, and remarkably self-assured for a teenager who'd experienced the kind of trauma that might have broken someone less resilient. The auditorium was packed with families, friends, and well-wishers. Sarah could see her mother in the third row, beaming with pride. Beside Jennifer sat Dr. Patricia Reeves, her therapist, who had asked to attend as a gesture of genuine affection and professional pride. In another section of the auditorium sat Judge Patricia Chen, also in attendance, though few people other than Sarah knew why the judge was there. It had become a tradition over the years, Judge Chen attending important milestones in Sarah's life, a quiet testament to the bond that had formed when she'd recognized a child in danger and taken action to protect her. Sarah's 8th grade achievement was particularly remarkable because it represented not just academic success, but emotional success. The girl who had once been trapped between impossible choices was now choosing her own path with clarity and confidence. She'd made the decision to try to rebuild a relationship with her father, now released from prison after serving 14 months. That relationship was cautious, carefully monitored, and would likely always carry the scars of what had happened. But David Mitchell had genuinely changed. His time in prison had given him space to confront his own behavior, his own need for control, his own capacity for manipulation. He'd completed extensive therapy and parenting classes. He'd written letters of apology to Sarah that weren't excuses but genuine expressions of remorse. He'd accepted supervised visitation with humility and patience. And Sarah, with the guidance of Dr. Reeves and the support of her mother, had decided to give him a chance at redemption. It was complicated, sometimes painful, but it was a choice Sarah was making for herself rather than one being forced upon her by adults. As Sarah's name was called and she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Judge Chen stood and applauded, a gesture that earned a quizzical look from people sitting nearby who didn't understand the significance. But Sarah saw it, and she smiled. That judge had changed the trajectory of her life. Without Judge Chen's perceptiveness, her willingness to intervene, her determination to protect a vulnerable child, Sarah's story would have had a very different ending. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the school's outdoor garden. Sarah found Judge Chen speaking with her mother and Dr. Reeves. "I'm so proud of you," Judge Chen said, embracing Sarah warmly. "Look at who you've become. Look at the strength you've developed. This is extraordinary." "I couldn't have done it without you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You believed me when no one else did." "I believed the evidence," Judge Chen corrected gently. "I believed what I observed. You provided that evidence by having the courage to tell the truth. All I did was my job, which is to protect children and uphold justice." But they both knew it was more than that. Judge Chen's decision that day had reverberated far beyond Sarah's personal story. In the years that followed, her ruling had become a landmark case in family law. Law schools taught Mitchell v. Mitchell as an example of judicial courage and child protection. Family law attorneys referenced it when arguing for protective measures in custody disputes. Child advocacy organizations cited it as evidence of how one judge's determination could reshape the system. More importantly, the case had prompted legislative changes. Several states had begun implementing new protocols for child witness preparation in custody cases, requiring documentation and court approval of any coaching or preparation. Judges nationwide became more attuned to the signs of coach testimony, the rehearsed quality, the unnaturally precise language, the disconnect between a child's demeanor and their words. Judge Chen had been invited to speak at judicial conferences about recognizing and responding to child manipulation in custody cases. In the courtroom where the original trial had taken place, there was now a small plaque on the wall, in recognition of the courage and integrity required to seek truth in the pursuit of justice. Few people knew it was placed there in reference to a single child who had tapped twice, then once, then twice on a witness box, a signal that had changed everything. Melissa Harrison had served her sentence and disappeared from public view, reportedly relocating to another state to start over. No one heard from her again, which was probably for the best. David Mitchell had served his time, completed his rehabilitation, and was rebuilding his life with genuine humility and a deeper understanding of the harm his actions had caused. He worked now as a consultant helping other men understand the dangers of parental alienation and manipulation. He'd written a book about his experience, candidly describing his thought patterns, his justifications, and his eventual understanding of the damage he'd caused. The book was required reading in several family law courses and was cited in custody disputes as a warning about the psychological tactics that some parents employed. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the story's legacy was Sarah herself. By the time she was in high school, Sarah had begun working with a local child advocacy organization. She participated in training sessions for mandated reporters, teachers, doctors, social workers, anyone who might encounter children being manipulated or abused. She spoke carefully about her experience, not to sensationalize it, but to help adults recognize the warning signs of coached testimony and parental manipulation. At 16, Sarah was asked to participate in a documentary about family law and child protection. The film, titled The Signal, featured her story alongside interviews with Judge Chen, Dr. Reeves, and various legal experts. It premiered at a film festival and was later picked up by a streaming service, reaching a national audience. In the documentary, Sarah spoke with remarkable clarity and maturity about her experience, about the complexity of loving a parent who had harmed her, about the journey from victim to survivor. "I think what's most important for people to understand," Sarah said in one interview segment, "is that children aren't responsible for adult conflicts. We shouldn't be put in positions where we have to choose between our parents or where we're made to feel like we're betraying someone by telling the truth. Adults need to do better. We need to protect children, not use them as weapons." The documentary won an award for Best Short Documentary at a prestigious film festival. Sarah attended the award ceremony with her mother and Judge Chen. When her story was announced as the winner, Judge Chen stood and applauded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. Afterward, she pulled Sarah aside and said, "This is your legacy. Not what happened to you, but what you've done with what happened to you. You've turned your pain into purpose. That's the most powerful thing a person can do." Jennifer Mitchell had also healed and grown. She'd returned to school and earned her master's degree in family therapy. She now worked at the same child advocacy organization where Sarah volunteered, specializing in helping parents and children navigate the aftermath of custody disputes. She often thought about how close she'd come to losing custody of her daughter, how easily she might have failed in her fight to protect Sarah if the child hadn't found the courage to speak truth. On the day Sarah graduated from middle school, Jennifer had written in her journal, "My daughter is the bravest person I know. She faced pressure that would have broken most adults. She chose truth over loyalty, and she did it at great cost to herself. I will spend the rest of my life honoring the courage she showed that day by living with integrity and compassion." By the time Sarah was 18 and preparing for college, the impact of that single day in court had become immeasurable. Custody cases nationwide were handled differently because of Judge Chen's decision. Children were being better protected. Manipulation was being recognized earlier. And Sarah Mitchell, the unlikely witness who had tapped a secret signal on a witness box, had become a voice for child protection and truth-telling. Judge Chen, now semi-retired but still occasionally taking cases, would reflect on her career and recognize that the Mitchell case was the moment that mattered most. Not because it was the most legally complex or the most high-profile, but because it was the moment she'd truly made a difference in a child's life. She'd looked at a vulnerable 8-year-old and seen not just a victim, but a person capable of extraordinary courage. She'd protected that child and, in doing so, had set in motion a chain of events that protected many other children. Years later, when Sarah was a freshman in college, she received a letter from her father. In it, David described his own journey, his continued therapy, his volunteer work helping other men understand the dangers of parental manipulation, his ongoing regret for the harm he'd caused. He wrote, "I will never be able to fully make amends for what I did to you. But I want you to know that I understand now the gravity of my actions, and I've dedicated my life to making sure other children aren't harmed the way I harmed you. You gave me the gift of consequences, and through those consequences, I found a better version of myself. I'm grateful to you for that, even though I know you didn't intend to give me that gift." Sarah read the letter many times, and each time she felt a complex mix of emotions: forgiveness, cautious hope, lingering pain, and ultimately acceptance. She had survived something that could have destroyed her. She had been brave when it mattered most. And in being brave, she had changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless children who would be better protected because of what she'd done. On a quiet evening in her dorm room, Sarah pulled out her old, worn copy of Mr. Floppy. The stuffed rabbit sat on her desk, a reminder of the 8-year-old girl who had been forced to choose between love and truth. She'd chosen truth, and that choice, terrifying as it had been, had opened the door to genuine freedom and healing, not just for herself, but for her mother, and ultimately even for her father. Sarah smiled, understanding finally that the signal she'd sent that day, 2 taps, 1 tap, 2 taps, had been more than a desperate cry for help. It had been the sound of a child finding her voice, and in finding her voice, changing the world around her. The end.